Thanks very much, Owen, and congrats to the whole Durham team on putting this winter school together. Excellent panel. Really looking forward to this conversation. I suppose just a couple of things before we make a start and introduce the speakers. We kind of set it up is really looking at not so much a debate, but looking at the representatives on the panel here is kind of really representing, core constituency of the left across Ireland, and seeing really trying to discuss how much the process of Irish unification is a priority in their activism. So how much is it seen as really an opportunity to advance core causes around the creation and just distribution of wealth, climate justice, neutrality, immigration, and all those type of issues. So it's very much a discussion, looking at the perspectives of the panelists and their experiences and the relevance of unity to those issues. But also towards the end of the discussion, I want to kind of look at the health of social movements across the island and see how much they're capable of being agents for change for kind of a progressive United Ireland. So thanks everyone for coming. It's a packed house here, which is class. I can see almost every faction in the room, which is always a good sign for these things. There might be some missing, but sure. So I'm going to do a brief intro of the panel. These are things that I pulled from, the source of truth. It's called Wikipedia. So I might get some things wrong here, but I'm going to wing it anyway. So on the far right here, not politics, but on the table is Chris Hazzard. Chris is Sinn Féin MP for South Down since 2007, when he ousted former SDLP MP and now Baroness Richie of Downpatrick, who would have thought. He's an MLA. He was an MLA. As an MLA, he was Minister for Infrastructure before the Assembly collapsed in 2017. Everyone who knows Chris and his politics knows that he's very active in solidarity movements, including the Bolivarian Revolution, Venezuela, Palestine, Cuba. And I read a quote one time he gave us a talk over in England where he talked about the need to work collectively to strengthen, renew and build international movements against imperialism and capitalism. So Chris, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
In the middle, no stranger to anyone in this room as well, is Bríd Smith. Bríd is a for-profit TD for Dublin South Central since 2016. Prior to that, Bríd has ran many elections, Council, Dáil, EU Parliament since 2006. However, I think it's fair to say her politics emerged out of activism as opposed to electoral politics. Bríd was shop steward with the Amalgamated Transport and General Workers Union, long-time anti-war and feminist activist. I read a very interesting quote online when Charlie Flanagan, I think, alleged you had an attack against democracy, and that was whenever you had the gall to question a judge who was earning about 200 grand a year for saying that an electrician who making 40 grand a year was earning too much money. That's the Free State democracy, I'd imagine. But after announcing Bríd stepping down as a TD, it has announced it should be running in the 2024 EU elections. So welcome, Bríd. And last, but certainly not least, on the far left, could be politics, is MEP for Dublin since 2019, Clare Daly. Before that was a TD since 2011. Clare was a Socialist Party councillor for 12 years in Fingal. Background as a trade union activist as well for SIP2 at Dublin Airport, and in 2003 was jailed for a month in relation to anti-bin tax protests. Clare's consistent support for Palestine, Julian Assange, her uncompromising support for Irish neutrality and anti-militarism has been, for me and many people I know, a real sort of injection of sense over the last couple of years using her platform in the to do that. So thank you and very welcome, Clare. So we're still going to have this discussion for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then open the floor for some Q&A on that as well. So we'll give a bit of a drill later, which will be the usual, please don't make big fucking statements, ask questions and all that stuff, okay? So I'm going to start off first. I want to kind of make this as practical as possible, avoiding as much abstract stuff around unity as well, to kind of delve into the issues that are facing communities north and south right now. But I just want to first start off with looking at the whole notion of border pull, where we're at with it right now. I'm going to ask this question to all of you to kind of answer in turn on this, and I'll start with you, Chris, over there. And just thinking, the border pull itself, as a moment can be seen from many perspectives. On one hand, we heard about this in the previous panel as well, is a border pull that merely inherits the problems that exist in both jurisdictions and merely extends jurisdiction of the 26 counties north, or is it a transformative moment as well? So in the sense of, a border poll, how far do you think it is off a border poll, and what type of border poll should that be?
Okay, gone a bit, Dessie, and thanks for the invite for the organisers to be here and to speak at the panel today. I suppose like the FILA and the summer, it's another fantastic opportunity for people to come together and talk about the issues that the cold face of struggle. I think we're going to have a referendum, or a sensitive referendum, fairly soon actually, and I think it could happen much quicker than what people think. The most important thing for myself, probably, and something that I've been developing in recent times, is that the important thing now, and what I might collectively term the Republican left, for, I suppose, a descriptor for the people in this room and across the island. I think the important thing for us to understand, though, is that, and it goes back to what Labhair said, right back to the 1840s, it's not about repeal of the Union, it's about repeal of the conquest. So it cannot be merely about partition. And thus far, the wider debate, the majority of the discourse has been about partition. And I think now is the time, there's an urgent need for the Irish Republican left to collectively work together to step in to the space to say, we have a vision. Because too much of the discourse so far has been based on the conventional political and economic orthodoxy of endless growth is going to somehow propel this new unitary state forward, and it's all going to go. We've been given numerous economic studies that suggest this isn't the case, but this is detached from the scientific reality in which we live. To quote somebody else, W.B. Yeats talked about romantic Ireland being dead and gone and with a weary in the grave. We're all going to be in the grave if we don't realise that there's not going to be a united Ireland unless it's a transformative, social transformative, economically transformative, and ecologically transformative. I only caught the last bit of the previous speech, our section, on climate change, etc. And we need to get real about this, and the Irish unity debate needs to get real about this. And I think this is where the collective Republican left needs to walk into that space and start putting forward ideas for how we want to transform, and that's much broader than partition. That's not to denigrate some of the work that has been done to date, because I think it has been really important actually to demonstrate that the Irish Exchequer can afford the North, for example, and to smash a lot of myths. A lot of the work that has been done in neoclassical economic models has been done for that purpose. But I think that purpose is now run its course, and I think there needs to be a space opened up, as I said, for the Republican left to stand up and to start to work in that dimension.
We're just thinking, what are you guys?
Okay. There's a lot I agree with what Chris said there, but I also want to add some more to it. Look, I was just talking to the Scullions coming up here today. I know them since I was 15 or 16 when Martin Forsyth was killed, and that's 50 odd years ago, and it's a long time. But it doesn't feel like that. But I do remember quite vividly, for a long part of that time, we talked in terms, in the Republican family, we talked in terms of a 32-county socialist republic. And you very seldom, if ever, hear the word socialism now used in the context of a united Ireland. And so, as well as what Chris argued, I want to say that we favour a border poll. Absolutely, we would call for a border poll in the morning. It should happen. It's absolutely the right of people to have one. Even under the current constitutional arrangements, we have a right to a border poll. But it will not bring about a united Ireland by stitching together some kind of, consensus or agreement between Protestant and Catholics linked in with the existing southern state. And that's why my heart jumped, high last week when I saw nearly 200,000 public sector workers out on strike here in the 6 counties and really fighting back united and showing that what has to be at the heart of a united Ireland has to be workers' power. It has to be about the working class. It has to be achieved by the working class for the working class. And in that way, and I think McCann said this very eloquently at the Guildhall in Derry, at the end of the day's strike last week, when there was rallies in all of the big cities, that when you look around you, when you see a group of workers with their, Unite flags and their Unison flags and their GMB flags, and they're really happy having had a general strike together more or less for the day in Northern Ireland for the first time in God knows how long, you can't tell what community they come from or what their allegiances are, but you can tell that they have hope, and lots of hope and ambition and power between them to actually change the way this country is run. And I just hope some of it becomes contagious inside the Irish working class, because if you just try to stitch all this together with a southern state, forget about it. Just walk around the streets of Dublin and look at how many people are sleeping in doorways, or, the 600 plus refugees that are being dumped onto the streets, sleeping in tents at the back of the Foreign Office, or whatever you call it, the International Protection Office. Go into to Limerick Hospital any day and look at the trolley crisis. Have a discussion with somebody who's homeless for 15 years and is in and out of homeless accommodation with their children. Many women who haven't had a Christmas in their own home since their kids were born. I mean, it's a mess. It's a shit show down there. But it's one of the richest economies in the world. It's like the third richest country, I think, before you do some economic measurement with it. We've 8 billion in reserves in this particular budget. The government aren't willing to part with it to deal with all of those really serious problems that cause the misery that people feel day in, day out. And in the meantime, the very wealthy get away with absolute blue murder. And to think that anyone would try and mirror that sort of economy by saying, let's reduce corporation taxes, let's not tax wealth, let's mind how we go with the American establishment because we really need to be linked in with that economy. That's a serious political flaw. And you only have to look at, as I say, the misery that people suffer day in, day out to realise that. So a united Ireland, border poll absolutely, but a united Ireland that should come out of it should be about front, centre and in the middle of it, and the force that's going to bring it about should be about the working class. And I mean the working class in the biggest sense, those that are unemployed, those that are on the margins, and even those who, in the confusion and the sort of the bewilderment that we have in our society at the moment, where there's tens of thousands out marching for the freedom of Palestine, and if you counted them all together, there's also tens of thousands out blocking the rights of refugees to have a home and a roof over their head. It's a really confused period. And I get it where the confusion comes in and where there's a vacuum and where there's a void, but that really puts it up to us all to put struggle at the centre of everything we do. And that struggle will pull people away from the racism and the marginalisation, will absolutely limit the scope of fascists to be able to influence ordinary people. And instead of looking down at the brown or black skin below you or the traveller below you, look up at the bastard that has created a two-tier economy that makes the rich richer and the poor poorer every day. And that's the message that has to come across. And in that scenario, absolutely Protestant and Catholics can live together, because what we're going to create, or what we could create, is a society that gives workers a better life and hope and a home and an education and the basic fundamentals that is everybody's right.
Thanks very much, Bríd. A couple of things that we touched on there that I want to explore a bit later were in terms of, you talked about the labour movement there being, or as an example of our social struggle kind of being a drive to kind of put this at the centre of the agenda, but also the growth of the farm right. So we do want to kind of touch on this afterwards as well. Claire?
Yeah, always hard to be last, but I suppose the question that Des asked at the start was, where are we with a border poll? And I think we are nearer to that than at any time since partition. The prospect now of the island being united is posed. And I think we would all agree here that it certainly has to be more than adding together two broken parts, for sure. But when you hear people like Leo Varadkar saying, yeah, United Ireland, that'd be okay with me, something has changed. And there is now a whole section of the capitalist establishment, north and south, who are actually salivating at the prospect of a 32-county neoliberal EU statelet. That's what they've planned. That's what they're actually organising for. They're actually beginning nearly the marketing of that prospect. And I think we need to obviously, in kind, respond to that. And we too should be organising, because while it's a challenge, it is an incredible opportunity as well. So why are we in this situation? Well, to me, we're in it for two kind of ironic reasons. And the first one being Brexit has caused a section of the capitalist establishment, in a desperate effort to get back into the EU and get back into the single market, to suddenly come round to, you know what, wouldn't be a bad idea, sure, if we united Ireland, it'd be great if we could stay in the EU. That's so you have the irony of the possibility of a united Ireland. At the same time, they wanted to be part of a bigger union that would straitjacket what a united Ireland could actually do. So you cannot have a discussion about it without looking at what type of Europe and what type of world does Ireland operate in. I think the second irony is that the possibility of a border poll is largely guaranteed because of the rise of Sinn Féin north and south of the border. And I think that that rise is not really at all because of a desperate desire for constitutional change. It's because of an absolute desperate desire to get out of the catastrophic economic situation that ordinary people are faced in on both sides. So if there was a border poll, Sinn Féin and everybody is going to have to grapple with the capitalist of that being the EU and having to in some ways genuflect to that, while at the same time recognising it is going to be a straitjacket. So for me, we have to talk about the EU. And in that sense, you should be aware that it is barreling down the road towards ever greater union. Ever greater union means ever less sovereignty for member states. And the whole idea of independence and unity was supposed to be about us being masters or mistresses of our own identity and our own being. And how can you do that if you're part of a bigger alliance? And we need to tease that discussion out. I don't want to stray into it maybe now, but I think it's incredibly relevant as part of this. But in that, it gives a great opportunity, because while the leadership of the EU, and the EU is a neoliberal capitalist union, undoubtedly so, and people have looked on in horror at what it has done in relation to the war of Israel against the people of Palestine. But that said, people all over Europe think the same as people in Ireland, and the desire and hope for a better Europe is out there. So a movement in Ireland which very much concentrates on looking outwards, being proud of our neutrality, because I think we absolutely cannot have a discussion about a new Ireland without enshrining neutrality. It's the key. We cannot be independent without it. International relations were never, if you like, a secondary issue for working class people. Our place in the world is key, and we need to have this discussion in the context of the changing world. Britain is changing, probably disappearing, let's be honest about it. America is in decline. We have a catastrophic climate crisis, we have armed camps re-emerging, and a new world order re-emerging. And it's against that backdrop that the move for a new Ireland actually could be incredibly powerful, because we're a country that was formerly colonised, but very much in the Western global North camp, with a kinship and an affinity for people in the global South. That's a powerful message. We can talk to empire on its own terms, and it could be an incredible beacon for people all over Europe and beyond. So I think we need to look at it in that context as well.
That kind of leads really well into the first kind of topic I want to discuss after the border poll, and that's really Ireland's place in the world. Clare talked about it there in terms of what does sovereignty mean. I think that, Irish neutrality has been the death by 1,000 cuts throughout the years. I mean, way back when Bertie Ahern said that joining the English Partnership for Peace would require a referendum before the election, and then he brought us into the Partnership for Peace. US military use of Shannon. Micheál Martin losing the run of himself towards the beginning of the Ukraine war by announcing that a referendum wouldn't be required for Ireland to join NATO, that it would be a government decision. Then Louise Richardson's public discussions on the review of neutrality in the South. And as this kind of constant undermining of not even the concept of neutrality, but the practical ramifications of Ireland's neutrality are constantly in their mind. It's left to people like Michael Lee Higgins, President Higgins, to kind of reflect the public mood on it. And I think that the public mood in Ireland has time again shown to be that there is support for neutrality, despite what the establishment are trying to do with neutrality. So I think that kind of asks the same question of all. Claire, if you don't mind, just pick up the mic again on this and going first. But I mean, first of all, it's just on the question of neutrality, how would you define neutrality, Irish neutrality? And then second kind of barrel that question is, how can that neutrality be safeguarded in a united Ireland?
Okay, well, I mean, as I said earlier, neutrality is the only guarantor actually of real independence and of sovereignty. For me, it's obviously not being involved in military alliances. It's not taking sides in great power conflict, but it's very much looking out for it. It's very much being that spirit of international solidarity, which Irish history is embedded in. So it's an active, positive neutrality. And when we saw in the war in Ukraine, the government saying, oh, you just want, when we argued for peace and that, oh, you just want to, let Russia get away with it. You want to do nothing. Being neutral is not doing nothing. Being neutral and relying on diplomacy is actually the best contribution we can make to Europe and to the world. So I can't remember what your actual specific question was.
Keep going.
Well, what I was going to say was, like, this is completely tied in with the EU. I mean, we know that the establishment in Ireland in the south has always bent the knee to NATO. They've never really been neutral. They've allowed Shannon to be used, and obviously Northern Ireland is part of NATO. But you can see what Irish neutrality means in the response of the people to the war in Gaza. That's what really neutrality and solidarity is. It's people getting off their feet and off their knees in that situation. And I think we need to embody that a lot more. Now, the European Union at the moment, and this is why it's tied in and we need to take account of it, because the Irish establishment will tell you, oh, well, of course we're not going to join NATO and of course we're not going to be in military alliances. But the EU now itself is developing into a military alliance and a defence union. It would take me all day to spend time on how that is actually unfolding. But trust me, an EU army is already in the making. Tens of billions of European taxpayers' money is already being spent on militarism, monies which could be used to alleviate other things. And the erosion of the triple lock in Ireland is being done so that Irish troops serving abroad will not be doing it under the banner of the UN peacekeeping mission. They may call it training missions or dress it up any way they like, but the operations being run under the banner of the EU are to further the strategic interests of the EU. That's what they're about. It's not about values, it's about interests and the prospects of Irish men and women being part of an army to serve the interests of German or French energy companies down in Africa, exploiting people there. That's not a fanciful prospect. That is happening now, in that those missions are there now. And that's what Micheál Martin wants to happen with the erosion of the triple lock. These aren't harmless missions. The EU has spent 8 billion in the Sahel, destroying that country at the behest of energy companies in France and in Italy. And then they dislocate the people there. Desperate people have to move out of the homes, come to seek refuge in Europe, and then you have another mess there as well. So our neutrality in that is not only saying we don't want to be part of that, it's very much saying we stand on the sides of those countries which the European capitalist interests are trying to undermine and exploit. And, you know, the thirst for that is phenomenal. It doesn't get reflected in the mainstream media here. But that message of neutrality that myself and Mick Wallace used the European Parliament to deliver, we can't go anywhere in Europe or even in the world without people saying to you, oh, we've heard your speech on that. And a Fine Gael minister rang me to tell me he was at a meeting in Africa in Rwanda or something, and these people said to him, "Oh, do you know Clare Daly? We follow her stuff on Twitter," and that anti-colonial message. So for me, that's what neutrality is. It's Irish people who were colonised before saying we stand with the ordinary people in the rest of the world. We stand for the non-aligned movement. We don't want anything to do with the great power conflict that's re-emerging again. We want non-alignment, we want peace, and we want all people to live together internationally. And I think that's really relevant.
Just to follow on from that, Claire, just the second part of the question, because, on paper Ireland is supposed to be neutral right now. So in the case of unification, how is that neutrality guaranteed in a way that it isn't right now?
Well, I mean, look, it's going to have to be a key part of the discussion. I mean, the northern half is going to have to leave NATO for a start. But to be honest with you, the south is edging into a situation where we're in NATO in all but name, because not being in NATO is irrelevant in some ways, because European defence is anchored in NATO, and there's countless speeches by the High Representative Joseph Borrell who'll tell you that. So both sides need to, I suppose, divest and pull out from that. But how do you do that? Well, I suppose you have to elect people who will deliver that. I mean, I would love to see it enshrined in the Constitution, our neutrality. That would certainly be a help. But we've got to mobilise to stop Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael getting rid of the triple lock, of all of this constant chipping away that's there. And I think the fact that the mask is off now, that people in Ireland and around the world can see Europe for its values in the blood of the children of Gaza, that we have an opportunity now like we never had before to ensure that. But it can only be delivered by
I couldn't have said it better myself. But just to add to what Claire said, because there's absolutely not a thing there I disagree with. You see, I think when you look back at the history of the EU and our participation in it, we have had our arms twisted up our backs many times to make changes that would allow the European Union structures that Claire talked about to chip away at our neutrality. When we voted against the Nice Treaty, we were told we were crazy, go back and vote again. Only this time they plaster the streets with posters saying, if you vote yes for Nice, you will get 20,000 jobs. Never happened. But what we did get was a weakening of our neutrality. And the same with Lisbon and the same with Maastricht. I can't remember all the details. I know we wrote pamphlets on it at the time and held public meetings and campaigned very vociferously along with others to try and convince people to reject these treaties. And people did, in each case, initially reject them, but the government came back, as I say, and twisted their arm and said there'll be unemployment, the sky will fall in unless you go down this road. And they're more or less saying the same thing to us again. And no doubt Micheál Martin is going to come up with legislation pretty soon, put it before the Dáil and say the triple lock has to go, otherwise the sky will fall in. And Claire explained it very clearly, that this is about pulling us into a military alliance. And the one thing I do think we have to remember, and particularly people in this room, in this movement, self-conscious socialist people of the left, is to go back to the First World War and the position that James Connolly took. Very difficult at the time. Even among socialists, it was a very difficult thing to say, we stand for neither king nor Kaiser but Ireland. And what he was saying there was exactly what Clare Daly has said. We do not subscribe to either side of the imperial powers. We want to see an independent country with an independent view, but it's also a rejection of capitalism itself, because wars like the First World War are a culmination of capitalist competition. And whether we call it the Third World War or not, the world is currently at war. It is currently at war in a very serious way. And as a consequence of the war on Gaza, now with the imperial powers bombing the Houthis, Iran bombing Pakistan and Pakistan bombing them back. I was just looking at that on Al Jazeera recently, because it's the only place you get a decent coverage of these events. And the amount of hardware, explosives, weapons, cruise missiles, the ones that are laughing all the way to the bank here are the global military industrial complex. The profits must be enormous. And that indicates to you that it's in the interests of the capitalist system, much and all as it's in decay, much and all as it's in crisis, and it is in quite a crisis, and you see that manifest itself through the climate crisis, the issue of refugees and all the rest of it, and inflation, which is something they're very worried about, going out of control out of them every so often. This is where having a neutral position and saying neither King nor Kaiser, neither Washington nor Moscow, were on the side of peace and neutrality, and actively on the side of the oppressed. Actively on the side of the oppressed, as you were in Belfast today, in Dublin, all over the country, marching for the Palestinians. That has to be our mantra. And whether or not we can construct something that if there was a border poll, I would suspect that if we got a united Ireland, it'd be a big thing, wouldn't it? Be a big deal. And as I said earlier on, it has to be about struggle and working class people at the heart of it. But it would mean a new constitution. It would mean having to totally take the Catholic Church out of the constitution. We're trying to do that in a sloppy way over the next few weeks, but it would mean totally removing references to church and all the rest of it. And in the course of designing the new constitution, you could double down and really lock in the idea of neutrality as part of what would be coming from a border poll, from an arrangement that would see a united Ireland come about. I think it's going to only come about through struggle, but whether it comes through struggle or constitutional arrangements, it will require us to advocate for neutrality to be locked into any future All-Ireland arrangement. Is that all right?
Yeah, I agree with much has been said. And, again, going back to the debate on Irish unity and the discourse that people will see very often on the radio and the TVs about, what the education system be, the challenges around social welfare and all the rest of it, and the difficulties about integration and reconciliation. This is one of the most complicated and complex and difficult issues, I think, that will arise, not least because of some of the things we touched upon before, given our position in the global north. But we need to remember a few things. So Ireland was the only colony in Europe, the first colony in the world, nearly 900 years. And that experience, I think, gives us a certain amount of leverage in the global north. And touching on what Clare says, we do have opportunities in corridors of power that movements across the world just simply don't have. And that's what we need to make it clear, from now and going forward, that there are certain things that will be red lines. And this is one of those things. Because if we don't, we will fall into the trap that others have fallen into. So if you look at Japan in 2009, Yukio Hariyama campaigned on closing the US base on Okinawa. He lasted 1 year. Hillary Clinton and the US Secret Services initiated a soft coup and he's gone. That's the level of fear in all of this that we have to deal with. That's the expectations. So when it comes to the EU, Claire's right, there's going to be massive conversations coming down the tracks at us. And we'll talk later perhaps on the rise of the right and how EU policies, etc., are framing some of that. But it is in the core principles. We will not be part of military alliances. We will not be feeding the military-industrial complex. We are anti-colonial, it is anti-imperialist. But let's remember, we're still a colony. They're still a foreign country, still claim sovereignty over 6 counties in Ireland, and we can't get past that fact. So this is part of it. We can't detach ourselves from that. Yes, we want to be part. We want to be part of the non-aligned movement in a multipolar world. But first and foremost is the integrity of our own struggle. And until we're independent, until we have went down that process of national liberation, a lot of these issues will be very, very, very challenging to deal with, and they will not be easy. And I think if you look at examples now at the minute, especially in Latin America, where certain people have learned those lessons. So if you look at Lula coming in Brazil, Lula is focused entirely on the domestic agenda. He is staying out of foreign policy issues almost entirely. AMLO in Mexico, whenever he came to power, they thought it was going to be a headbutton with the US more or less straight away. He didn't do it. He stayed out. It's been building domestic strength. So, it's been touched upon already about the prospect of, a Sinn Féin win in the next general election in the South. That represents the biggest breach in the rampart of the political establishment in the South, perhaps in a century. A massive opportunity. But the imperative importance of that will be about, as I called earlier on, the Irish Republican left using it as an opportunity to build and galvanise our domestic strength for the social transformation and the liberation process that comes in forward of it. And we need to be so careful around issues of neutrality. They're central to all of us. And that's why I think some of these conversations need to start now. And that's why in Europe, in America, wherever it may be, we need to be making it very clear, we're not going to be part of your club, and you have to respect those red lines.
I'm sure some of your name was Twitter, just, I mean, it might be implicit in what you're saying, but would you see that a constitutional guarantee would be needed in a...
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And I have no fear of that. I have no doubt that the Irish people understand that, neutrality and everything about that is central to our psyche, it's central to who we are. Right back to us talking, the reason why that neutrality came about, it's central to the notion of Irish independence. And the rest of the world, especially the Global South, they look upon us as a model to be able to replicate that. So ensuring a constitution going forward, absolutely. I have no doubt that the Irish people would deliver that message. And that's what empowered Michael D. Higgins to say what he said recently. And I think that's one of the biggest fears when it comes to the political establishment in Dublin, because they understand that and they know that, and they know that's about to slip away from them.
Thanks, Chris. I'm just going to move on to the kind of the phenomenon of the growth of the far right. Globally, regionally, domestically, we had a panel on just before this looking at social movements in United Ireland. We had one of the county representatives from Derry, and it was just a comment she was making about how racism seems to be eking its way into everyday life. So you couldn't get an appointment at a GP, and the person on the phone at the GP saying there's so many immigrants that you just can't get an appointment at a GP. So it's kind of, we've seen the kind of overt racist attacks in Belfast that seem to be a kind of a constant here. There's clear links with loyalist paramilitaries in many of those issues, and a reticence on the police to kind of tackle that issue. In Dublin riots in November, and the wave of kind of anti-immigrant protests and the kind of Ireland is full movement. And I might be completely wrong about this, but what hasn't, you get spikes in these activities that happen, and what doesn't seem to kind of catch yet is a kind of popular movement that is kind of catapulting to political power on the back of that, but it does reflect a wider trend globally, whether it be the Netherlands, Holland, Finland, Italy, the rise of the AfD in Germany as well. Liberal media tend to very much paint this as a singular movement that you can track from Trump to Brexit to AfD without looking at the kind of context for each of these. And Bríd, I'm going to ask you to kind of come in here first, but there was an altercation outside Leinster House in 2022, and afterwards you had said something about there are a lot of very angry and very alienated people out there, and I understand it. I meet them frequently, I try to help them as best I can, and what really sickens me is the way they're manipulated by the far right, and often people who present themselves as very respectable fascist leaders. So in your kind of organising, in your experience, what are the kind of underlying causes for the growth of this kind of sentiment in Ireland?
Yeah, look, it's a real difficulty because, along with Clare and lots of other TDs, we very successfully had a big campaign against water charges from, say, 2014 to 2016. In the 2016 election, a whole chunk of us got elected to the Dáil on the left who had led or had been prominent in that campaign. But it was a real people power movement from below, involving communities, estates, involving workers, and tens and tens of thousands of people marching many times on the streets against water charges and actively opposing and physically opposing the installation of water meters. And when I say they were brilliant people, they were and are brilliant people, but the amount of that cohort, say just in my own constituency, I can't honestly speak for every constituency, but I know from talking to others, the amount of people who were prominent in the water charges movement who are now courting or courted by the far right is actually astounding, is really quite shocking and a wee bit depressing, to be honest with you. Like, I met this brilliant woman in the supermarket in Aldi's last week. She used to lead the people at Bluebell sitting with summer, and they used to bring out their plastic chairs and sit on the shores that the workers tried to put the water meters in, and then flirt with them and flirt with the coppers and say, oh, you're gorgeous, will you sit in my lap and all this. So they had real direct action and blocked something happening, but in a great way. They had a great style about them, they were funny and nobody could really harass them or arrest them or give them a hard time. They'd have you in stitches. And in the supermarket the other day, she's shouting at me, if I was black, I'd get this, and if I was black, I'd get that. You have to be black in this country to get anything. And in equally loud a voice, I challenged her and I said, where are you coming from with this, Annette? This is not true. And we had this conversation which other people stood by and listened. But the amount of crap that's being swallowed lock, stock and barrel and going unchallenged is unreal. And there's bile and there's lies and there's goddamn lies. And ordinary working class people are swallowing. I know they're getting it from social media. I know the sort of Trump gang are adept at producing videos and making arguments and going down and, creating images that aren't true. But the way people are swallowing it is quite sad and quite shocking. I'm wondering to myself, are they left too weak at coming back on this stuff? And maybe we need a discussion on how we reflect that in, probably in social media terms. But in reality, what is needed is struggle. And struggle will always cut across all of that bullshit. And I tried to allude to it earlier on, talking about the strike last week here in the north and how McCann mentioned you wouldn't know who's who and from what community. When you look at workers, we're all the same. And that in reality is what's required. But there's also something else required, and that's to call them out. And we have them in Dáil Éireann using the platform to talk about the Great Invasion, the plantation coming again, the conspiracy theories are brought right into the chamber by mostly rural independent TDs, but some dodgy ones on all sides, apart from the left, who are using what they think is the popular mood at the moment to try and garner votes. It's the election they're thinking about, not the society we live in, not the people, not the communities. It's how many votes they can get. And it's quite disgraceful. So I think we have to repeatedly call them out. We have a situation developing in Ballyfermot, probably over the next day or two, where a place that's supposed to be earmarked, an old industrial estate, supposed to be earmarked for a centre for international protection. When you hear international protection, the fascists, and will put out the message, this is black and brown men who are unvetted of military age, who are a threat to your women and children. There's no bigger threat to women and children in Ireland than the men and their family. And I'm not saying all men, but the statistics show that where there's violence inside a woman's life or a child's life, it comes from somebody they know inside the family. And the state pathologist, the former state pathologist, recently said, when she did a documentary on femicide, it's the man in your bed you need to be aware of, not the man under your bed. It is so intimate, the question of the question of what threatens women and children, and is being used and turned by the far right to say it's all about brown and black-skinned men. They'll reluctantly accept families, but even then they'll, as you saw in Rosscray, they'll cause such a fuss about it that they'll frighten the children from Afghanistan or Mongolia or wherever they're coming from. And these are people that are already traumatised. I'm extremely sad about it, but I'm angry with the political establishment who make concessions to it. Only the other day, a former MEP, Claire probably knows her well, Marion Harkin, used her opportunity in the Dáil to bang on about how scared women are of these unvetted military-age men. What are you going to do about it? Women are genuinely scared. Quite disgraceful, and they should be stopped from using platforms in this way. And the left and Sinn Féin really have to call them out. And here's the problem. It may be subtle concessions, but Sinn Féin also makes subtle concessions. Whether it's by speaking at a rally, a TD speaking at a rally in Rosscray, or saying, well, I understand the community are angry. We need to be really tough on this and really clear. There is no place for that kind of racism in our society. And politicians do come under pressure to bend, to squeeze, to go this way or that way because they're worried about their backyard. And I'm telling you now, there are people in my community, my neighbours, who think like this. And I lose votes over it. But that doesn't matter. If we're trampled to the ground electorally, that doesn't matter. We have to stand up to it and build a movement against it. I probably would just like to add, we are trying. It's not like we're sitting back in shock and horror. And we did get together all of the sort of civil society groups, you know, the anti-racist groups, the left parties, independent groups. women's groups, LGBT groups, and we had a fantastic demonstration of about, some people said 50,000, I think it was probably more like 35 or 40 in an Ireland for All response this time last year. And we're planning a similar one now on the 24th of February. It's probably going to be a bit more difficult to break through those barriers, but we are all working together. So whenever we go into an organising meeting, there's like 35, 36 groups represented at those meetings. So it is very positive, and there is a real desire to push back against it. And national demonstrations are important, but at a local level, it's even more important.
Thanks, Bríd.
Oh, sorry, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, back in the question, you might want to come back and some stuff that Bríd said there as well, but also just, the broader thing about the phenomenon of the growth of the far right.
Yeah, well, I think anybody that's studied Gonski and the interwar period will see the same interregnum and the word sick with the morbid symptoms, and that's exactly what we're living through. There has been a crisis in liberal democracy now for quite some time. We're at the lowest point in public trust in our civic institutions and the civic processes. This is on the back also of the neoliberal collapse. And if you take, for example, that wave of people that was behind Brexit, coming from the northern parts of England, if you take the people that was behind Trump, coming from the Dust Bowl, and that's the effect of neoliberalism and Reagan and Thatcherite economics in the 1980s. And we're starting to see the seeds of that. I think some of that is applicable here in Ireland. Whenever you see the collapse, and when you look at the figures, the absolute collapse in public investment in public services and public infrastructure in the Western world, a lot of the frustrations that Bríd has just outlined is through the lack of access to these public services, and people are lashing out. So the response that we have to do is we need to nurture sites of struggle outside of the confines of parliamentary life, because the public and the ordinary people have very little trust in parliamentary life and politicians. How many times do you hear that? The politicians. So we need to nurture sites of struggle outside of that. We need to rebuild sites of political education. Political education is so important in all of this. We need to rebuild the trade union movement. We need to rebuild community organisations. And I think when it comes, and the reason why we need to do that, more or less since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the global left has literally collapsed back in on itself and reduced itself to electoralism and online petitions. And we need to move away from that and realise that all progress is through struggle. And it's mobilising and agitating, and we need to get back to that. In Ireland, I think there's an extra dimension for the left, and I think it's a failure on all of our behalf. And there's a crisis in rural Ireland. And nobody in the Irish Republican left has got to grips with this. And in the failure to get to grips with this, we have allowed the regressive right neo-fascists to start to plot their way through it. I'm doing a wee piece of work at the minute actually in rural Ireland. And over Christmas, looked at the sites and recent publications of all the left political parties in Ireland. We're not at the races when it comes to rural Ireland. There's a massive depopulation crisis. Our coastal communities are on their knees. Employment issues in rural Ireland, the cost of living in rural Ireland outstrips anything in the city, and we're starting to see that the regressive forces are starting to really make hay in rural Ireland. I think we need to discover, and I know people in this room will know Conor McCabe very well. He's brilliant. He's done a brilliant talk actually at the Trademark Summer School Cross Clay in the summer around Peadar O'Donnell, and talking about the importance of the rural communities when it comes to national liberation in Ireland. And I think the Irish left needs to be very, very serious, move out of the cities and the towns and get serious about rural Ireland, because I think we can start to eat back some of this. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble.
I don't want to guide you too much in your answer to this, but there's a quote here that I pulled up that I kind of liked. It was, you were saying, people hear European leaders waffle on about European values and it means nothing. There's a growing disconnect and the beneficiaries will be the far right. Responsibility for that lies with the political sector.
Yeah, I think that is a huge reason. I mean, right across Europe, ordinary people are boiling mad, and it is a legitimate anger. They are absolutely fuming at the economic conditions that they're living in, how their communities have been neglected, how they've been forced to bear the cost of the Ukraine war through sanctions that the EU imposed that just shot themselves in the foot, the massive energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, the lunatics who are running the asylum that is in every country in Europe, and people feel their voices aren't being learned. And it is the failure of the centre, no question. The inequality in the EU now is greater than any time in its history. The concentration of wealth into fewer hands while ordinary people are really suffering. And combined with that so-called centre that might talk politically correct when it likes, has been dog whistling around the issue of migration as well. Quite simply, quite true. Europe does not have a migration crisis, except for the people who are the migrants. Certainly Europe doesn't. Europe has a deficit of workers that it needs. We desperately need to bring in new blood. Other countries around other continents are, our birth rate is slow and all the rest of it. You know the figure. So it's not a problem, but they've manufactured a problem to divert attention from themselves. And I think one of the things that's brought it home in Ireland is their response to the war in Ukraine, which the Irish government did and the EU did everything in its power to make sure that war continued. That was their game at the behest of the military-industrial complex. They stood in the way of peace. They ensured that it continued on. And to do that, they had to allow millions of Ukrainians into Europe and give them sort of an easy path into that. And don't get me wrong, obviously fully in favour of anybody who wants to come to Ireland, be it for economic reasons or for safety, to be allowed to come here. But they introduced a two-tier system, a racist system, which was racist towards other migrants and refugees who've been coming here for years, and which was racist to Irish people. And for me to say that, I think there's a silence around these issues that, oh my God, if you say that, you might be called a racist yourself. But when the government comes in and says, we will build houses for Ukrainians, and I'm somebody in a community where my daughter's been on the couch with her kids living in the spare room for 10 years, and no one ever said they were going to build a house for me. Well, you're going to be pissed, like, of course you are. And you're going to say, well, you obviously don't care about me. You just said you don't care about me. And then when that person gets cross about that, then you label them far right. And they go, well, I hate you. I hate what you've done to my country. I hate what you've done to my economic. Well, I must be far right then. And then there's people who are kind of stoking that. All of those elements that are so creatively used in social media, that's on everywhere. Those elements in the European Union have been active in Ireland. They've come over here, they've had meetings, they've made soundings. They've actually got up and given speeches in the Parliament how, wouldn't this be great? Even in Ireland now, we're growing, kind of thing. So there is influence behind this. And I think the only way of combating it is absolutely through activism in the ground. But I mean, I think I've heard all of the stories that Bríd outlined about the people coming up with absolute nonsense about the conditions of migrants and refugees who are treated horrifically in Ireland, let's be honest about it, but it is the ones who are being treated horrifically, who are in the direct provision, who are sleeping out on the street, who are identifiable because of the colour of their skins, who are bearing the brunt of the government's racist policy. So I think we have to be a bit careful in some ways. Some of the way in which I suppose it has fed into it is the sort of politically correct response from the Irish Times, kind of going, oh my God, these riffraff now in Ireland who are kind of objecting to this. When I brought down some organic vegetables to a little refugee lady who was living down the receipt, and I gave her some of my clothes, that talking down sort of stuff as well. It just enrages people to kind of go, you smug git, sitting in your nice house with your nice, telling me I'm a racist, would you ever go on? And all of that isn't helpful. We have to really seriously address the dire situation that people are in. Absolutely stand against that being manipulated as well. But it's not easy. It's not easy to get that balance right. And the only way you can do it, I think, is by being active on the ground and rebuilding that, standing in solidarity, absolutely calling it out, but being very mindful to, I suppose, a lot of what's really driving it for people. But it is a phenomenon now that is being manipulated everywhere, and it is incredibly dangerous, I think, you know. And Ireland is being looked at. One of the things you touched on, Des, was about there isn't really anybody to capitalise on it politically at the moment. But absolutely, there are elements looking at Ireland to that end, and it wouldn't be past them at all if they could get a big name to stand in a couple of the constituencies in Ireland. They would probably get elected, and that would be, if, say, for example, someone like Conor McGregor stood in Dublin, the whole of, I can guarantee you, people in Europe, that would be the talk of Europe. And he could get elected, because loads of people are pissed off and go, I couldn't give a shite, I hate all politicians, that European Union is a load of crap anyway. Feck it, why not? Just to throw a petrol bomb into the thing. So we could see that. That doesn't mean that everyone learned is far right or lost to us or anything like that. It just means we really have to get in on the ground and organise to change the economic situation that people are living in, or otherwise ordinary people have been manipulated down a cul-de-sac.
We're getting a bit of time, but I'd still like to do one more question before we open up the floor. If you are all okay for that. I kind of want to bring the talk back, or channel the talk into the kind of unification process again. And just thinking, you know, I think it was last week, Ireland's climate change assessment was released about the 26 counties failing to meet its targets. But, you know, one of the conclusions they pulled out was that there was a political and a public disconnect between climate science and taking appropriate action. And what it said was that the public demonstrated a real strong understanding of the need for climate action, yet there's a gap between that desire and action on behalf of the establishment or the state forces. And, you know, it seems to me, Chris talked there about really the kind of decline or the growing failures of liberal democracy. I know Claire's talked loads about the kind of influence of lobbyists in the EU as well, and basically a corporate capture of democracy, so much so that if change is going to happen, it could take 2 electoral cycles before something happens. And there's something there that representative democracy that we know of isn't capable of responding with the expediency necessary for the climate issue, but also for the issues that we discussed in the growth of farming. They are both not capable and maybe not willing to do it. So when you take that in the context of unification, you know, there are other models of democracy that are emerging as examples across the world. And I'm thinking about an initiative as opposed to kind of national democracy. So, you know, citizens' assembly processes in the South, elsewhere, participatory budgeting things, but other ways that you can construct democracies. And what I'm kind of wondering is your views on, whenever you're talking about a new constitutional framework for Ireland, should we be reviewing the democratic structures there as well, as opposed to just kind of basically extending the electoral areas of the South to the North? And Chris, you go on first, would you?
Yes, absolutely, and that's what we need to see, the participatory. And you see this right across, you know, from Reykjavik to all different parts of the world. You can see what participatory democracy is becoming a very useful tool, and it's not only in the sphere of politics that we need to do that. We need to democratise information. So our universities and our schooling system, we need to democratise the economy. We need to talk about public ownership. You know, how many ordinary people genuinely have an understanding of economics and political economy. That's not by accident. That's not by accident that is the case. So yes, absolutely. And you see this when it comes to climate change and the disaster that we face. And make no mistake about it, we have entered the mass sixth extinction event in planetary history. That is where we are at. And it's now about what do we do to try and roll back and give ourselves a chance. Any notions of, and you hear this constantly from the centre and you hear it constantly from the parties of the right, talking about green growth, is just absolute fantasy. And we need to be very, very serious about that. And as I talked about earlier on, the core component of all of this is this notion of endless growth. And to give people an understanding of this, Because the Irish economy, there's this notion put around the world of how green Ireland is and how great we are when it comes to nature and everything else. Nothing to be further from the truth, and we have to understand that. So, for example, when you look at the biocapacity, we the Irish economy exceeded it 50 years ago. In the 1960s, we already had it exceeded it. So, for example, the extractive nature of the Irish economy, if the rest of the world was built the same way and needed the same resources we would, it would take 3 planets to actually meet the needs. That's how extractive the Irish economy is. And there's no understanding of that. I don't think, beyond those people who are very much interested in this, the wider populace and ordinary people, there's no understanding of that. They look at climate change, I think, and they see small islands in the Pacific disappearing, and there's a little bit of recognition around why there's a bit of climate at the minute, or whatever it might be. But whenever we're talking about heat waves, the BBC or RTE put a picture of a lecture on the beach. They don't talk about the people dying because of heat waves. And again, we have to continually have to challenge that. And this is central, as I said, to go back to the Irish unity part, because there's not going to be it. And one of our colleagues, Sean Farron, has done some work on this. Again, he's speaking of that summer school again. There's still been, as he said, no United Ireland in the dead planet. And we have to come to terms with that. And then, so the wider Irish left has to come to terms and say, okay, we need to start talking to people. We need to start mobilising, educating people, and let them understand that. So, no doubt, this will be picked up again. Some of the questions. I don't know if that answers your particular question, but
Yeah, I suppose also thinking in terms of how the debate is currently being framed for unification, in the sense that the constitutional question on unification seems to be something that could happen down the line alongside everything else we're working on, as opposed to a massive opportunity to actually address a lot of the issues that we're seeing as well. So, John Barry was on here before talking about welcoming the debate because it opens the door to proper envisioning what the hell could happen on this island. And instead of it seeming to be a point in history that could come around to Fine Gael, Fine Gael, and everyone else agreed to it, hey, we got it, it's more about, actually using it as a revolutionary moment.
Absolutely. And just to put a very short point on it, it is about advancing that social and ecological and economic transformation. And this is the opportunity to do it, because Fine Gael's not going to do it, Fianna Fáil's not going to do it, the political establishment in Britain's not going to advance it. So this is our opportunity to do it. As I said before, what I hope is a Sinn Féin win at the next general election in the south that's coming very soon, being the biggest breach in the ramparts of the establishment, that affords an opportunity for the wider Irish Republican left and the Green movement as well, the wider Green movement, not the political Greens, to use that breach in the ramparts to go through and say, right, we have an opportunity here to build something new, and let's get on with it.
Like this. Just before you start, Claire, Bríd and yourself and myself sort of grew out of the Labour movement as well. And, this question of democratic visioning, I remember the Labour movement used to actually propose alternative models of society that wasn't just about strengthening bargaining rights and all that, get a bigger slice of the pie, but it used to be a political education process in the trade unions, and it seems to have dropped that off. So, that's what I'm kind of wondering about, that alternative vision in the Constitution.
Yeah, and I suppose I'm more out of that loop now, being in Brussels rather than at home, but the trade union movement has been fairly gutted in terms of a lot of its activity, even on economic issues, not to mind the bigger picture that it used to organise on politically, which is so great that we see initiatives like Trademark. They have been incredible in terms of educating people and raising that political consciousness, which is the only way forward. We talk about democracy, but democracy is seriously overrated. It's you can say what you like, but do what you're told. And now you can't even say what you like because they're criminalising hate speech, they're criminalising political speech. They can say they're criminalising hate speech, but actually that means those in power are trying to control political dialogue and so on. So the only way to challenge that is by activating people really and mobilising them. Now that is difficult when you've given over a lot of your powers, even economically, to the likes of the EU to make decisions on. That's putting yourself in a straitjacket. You can elect a government then, but that government's hands are tied. So I suppose my point is that all of this is tied up in the idea of energising people, and I do see the possibility of a a border poll, a new Ireland, a united Ireland, which, as I said at the start, the neoliberal elements are definitely viewing as a marketing opportunity to, prostitute to the world a united Ireland, to make money out of it, to market it for exploitation to global capital. That's the name of the game for them. But the only way that can be challenged is by, I think, having the conversation in all of the areas where people are found. And it's through that then, and people saying, well, what is a new Ireland? What does it mean to you? That you meet the people who have the problems, who think have been, misled by the racist arguments or whatever, that you meet the people with the different issues. And to be honest, that's the only way in which you really build a new society anyway, either with or without a border poll or a new Ireland. That's what you need to do, is bottom-up democracy. Activism is the only way. I mean, it's this myth that politicians change things. They don't. The people change things up against, and the politicians drive them screaming and kicking and that sort of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a long-winded answer probably, but it is the only way, and we do have an opportunity for sure in it.
Come on, start. Bríd.
I'm a little bit confused about your question, Dessie, to be honest. Could you clarify? You started talking about climate change and you end up talking about democracy.
I suppose looking at the kind of constitution or the constitutional question, opening the door to new democratic structures in Ireland. So should the constitution look at redesigning our democracy?
I was hoping you were going to talk about climate change. It's one of my favourite topics. But you didn't ask me that. I'm going to give that answer anyway. Look, I find it difficult to see everything through the prism of United Ireland. I know that's what this debate is about, but to be honest, I don't think that that's how all change is going to come about. And if you take climate change as an example, I do think that what we require is to try and see the world from an anti-capitalist point of view. Try and think about a society that doesn't run for profit. You think about that for a minute. Everything we do is run for profit. And if you try to remove that, then what structures and how would you put in place a society that is not for profit? A simple example, and a very new one, is data centres. Data centres in the Republic of Ireland run rampant all over the place because mainly they're built by the Googles and the TikToks and the sort of global, what you call the multinationals, who are headquartered in Dublin because they get huge tax breaks and who are given a green light to do whatever they like with planning applications. So where Clare used to live, that area, Dublin 15, littered with these massive big data centres. And they're currently consuming 18% of the national grid, according to the people who run the national grid. I can't think of the name of them now. But anyway, the national grid people. According to their statistics, the data centre proliferation is currently consuming 18% of the energy we produce, and that includes renewable energy. Every other country across the planet, bar Singapore, which is also a tax haven, keeps the ratio of data centres to the usage from the national grid down to around 6 to 9%. Never let it go beyond that. Singapore, I think, went as high as 11 or 13. Ireland's at 18. And there is a company that have done new data on this beyond what the national grid people have told us, which have projected only last week that by 2026, 32% of the national grid will be soaked up to power data centres. That's because there's 85 new applications in to build that many in the next couple of years. And again, it's all TikTok, Google, who's the guys, Amazon, huge. They've got data centres all over the place. And the purpose of these data centres is not to allow us to transmit this meeting or to go on Zoom conferences to organise anti-racist events or to watch movies on Netflix. The purpose of these is to sell you shit. It's to advertise and to sell you and to beam through and to convince you that you have needs beyond what you actually humanly need. You need to have this new gadget that boils eggs differently. You need to have that bed for your dog. You need to have that gorgeous new clothes from China that only cost €10 or something. And this is capitalism writ large, and it has been allowed to go mental in the Republic of Ireland. It is one of the biggest tax havens. It's a mortal sin of a place. It is so pro-capitalist. And I think we need to start really talking about what would an anti-capitalist United Ireland look like. We'd have to get rid of all that nonsense, and we'd have to prioritise whatever energy we produce, and we do produce a lot of renewable energy. We could produce even more. Needs to go into powering our hospitals, our transport systems, our education centres, our cities, heating people's homes to an adequate degree. People live in very cold homes in the Republic. So I think we have to start revisiting all that kind of stuff and looking at a world that's built for not for profit. And the other aspect of that is how we deal with care. And this is going to come up in the constitutional amendment that we're going to have to vote on soon. Care should be the new word that looks at a new society. Care and repair, as Naomi Klein calls it, in the Green New Deal should be at the heart of any new society. The most important thing you can do is care for each other. Look after the elderly, look after the disabled, look after children, give more, nurses jobs, give more teachers jobs, give more SNAs jobs, all of that stuff. So I think we have to start thinking, and everybody here I'm sure is interested in United Ireland, we have to start thinking about it in anti-capitalist terms, in terms about how we organise an economy that's planned, but that's built for the benefit of people and not for profit. Get rid of Amazon, Google and all that crap. They end up actually building centres to burn the crap that they didn't sell you. And that then more emissions into destroying our planet and hurtling us towards the catastrophe that Chris talked about.